I grew up in the shadow of Wrigley Field, in a neighborhood we called Wrigleyville. My family's apartment was right on Waveland Avenue, directly across from the iconic ballpark. As a kid, my world revolved around the Cubs and the game of baseball. It was more than just a pastime, it was an all-consuming passion. I was part of a gang of neighborhood boys who called ourselves the Club Dogs. We weren't a gang in the criminal sense. Our sole mission was to chase down every foul ball that sailed over the bleachers and into the streets. The ultimate prize was getting those balls signed by players after the game. We had our regular crew, but that summer when I was 13, some older, rougher guys started hanging around with us. I was a scrawny, geeky kid with thick glasses and oversized hand-me-down clothes, an easy target for their bullying when the others weren't looking. That should have been a red flag, but I was young and naive. All I cared about was getting my first foul ball. Little did I know, that ball would change the trajectory of my life forever. It happened in early August, on a sweltering day much like this one as I stood outside the old storefront 44 years later, flooded by bittersweet memories. The Cubs were playing the Cardinals, and we Club Dogs had gathered by the stadium, strategizing our ball-snagging tactics. The new guys showed up reeking of booze, already picking fights with passers-by. Our ringleader Kevin tried to keep them in check, but they weren't having it. A few of the younger guys started drinking too, swayed by the debased posturing. My instincts told me to steer clear. Growing up watching how alcohol destroyed my father, and by extension my family, I wanted no part of it. Kevin warned me and the other youngest kid Tommy to stay away from the troublemakers. We all spread out, eyes glued to the sky, waiting for that telltale crack of the bat meeting ball. Finally, it happened, a foul ball arcing majestically over the fence. And it was headed straight for me. I could barely believe it as I raised my glove, tracking the ball's descent, until it sailed right over my head and crashed through the front window of Charlie's corner store. What happened next remains seared in my memory like a waking nightmare. The older guys rushed into the store, allegedly to retrieve the ball. Tommy and I naively followed, but they weren't after the ball at all. They unleashed a savage, drunken assault on Charlie, the gentle old man who ran the shop. I stood paralyzed as they pummeled him mercilessly, my whole body going numb. The repulsive sound of knuckles striking flesh, bones crunching, the metallic scent of blood hanging thick in the air. Charlie's feeble hand stretching toward me pleadingly before going limp. The bloody baseball that started it all rolling to a stop at my feet. Kevin dragged us out of there, making us swear to never breathe a word of it to anyone unless we wanted to go to prison. Shell-shocked, I ran home and barricaded myself in my room, replaying those horrific moments incessantly. Days later, I overheard my dad telling my mom the news. Poor old Charlie had succumbed to his injuries later that night. I sobbed into my pillow, consumed by suffocating grief and guilt. If only I hadn't called out for that ball. Consumed by trauma and terrified of being implicated, I never spoke of it to a soul. To my immense relief, we moved to New York City shortly after. I did everything I could to distance myself from that memory and those people. But try as I might, I couldn't outrun it. The nightmares and crushing guilt followed me into adulthood. Through a string of failed relationships, a battle with alcoholism that nearly killed me, the loss of my parents, that gruesome scene remained indelibly etched in my psyche. Now here I was, 57 years old, divorced, childless, finally gathering the courage to return to the scene of the crime and put those demons to rest. I had booked a room by the airport, giving myself a few days to acclimate before venturing into my old neighborhood. I rode the L train into the city, the elevated tracks rattling just like they had all those years ago. So much had changed, with shiny new skyscrapers dotting the skyline, unfamiliar shops and trendy restaurants lining the streets. But that underlying rhythm and energy of the city remained comfortingly familiar. I revisited cherished childhood haunts, immersing myself in happier memories of carefree days with my family before everything went to hell. I even made a nostalgic pilgrimage to Navy Pier, marveling at how it had transformed into a sprawling wonderland of food and attractions that dazzled the senses. For a few blissful moments, I was that wide-eyed 13-year-old again, brimming with innocence and untainted enthusiasm. But eventually, I couldn't put it off any longer. I had to go back to Waveland Avenue, had to confront the ghosts that still haunted me. So one morning, I steeled my nerves and made my way to Wrigleyville. The closer I got, the more my stomach roiled with unease. The old neighborhood was virtually unrecognizable now, full of upscale bars and boutiques catering to well-heeled baseball fans. Ticket prices were astronomical, with the rooftop bleachers that used to offer free glimpses of games now monetized and sold as premium seating. Everything had been commercialized. I turned onto Sheffield Avenue, my feet dragging with each step. There was a game on. I could hear the roar of the crowd, and the scent of hot dogs and spilled beer hung in the air. It brought me right back to that fateful day. I couldn't bring myself to even glance down the street to where Charlie's store had been. Not yet. I hurried down to the next block, trying to clear my head. A few landmarks remained. There was the old-fashioned soda shop we used to frequent after games, still packed with families seeking icy refuge from the muggy weather. And the dive bar where my dad routinely drank himself into oblivion, my poor mom sending my older brother to drag him home night after night. I could still hear them arguing, my father's slurred rationalizations, my mother's choked sobs. Those memories steeled my resolve to never follow in his footsteps, although I did have my own bout with the bottle after what happened. It was a miracle I managed to stop when I did. I knew I was just stalling now, postponing the inevitable. I had come all this way for a reason. Mustering every ounce of courage I had, I turned the corner onto Sheffield. And there it was. Or rather, there it wasn't. The storefront that had once housed Charlie's corner store was boarded up, plywood covering the door and windows. A faded for sale sign hung crookedly, the only pop of color amidst the dingy, graffitied facade. It looked like it had been shuttered for years, frozen in time. Just like the traumatized 13-year-old version of me. A strangled sob erupted from my throat as I sank to the ground, all the bottled-up anguish pouring out of me in waves. Tears streaming down my face. I was transported back to that wretched August day. The sickening sounds and smells crashed over me anew. But for the first time, I let myself truly feel it, reliving every awful moment. I ugly cried until my eyes were swollen and my voice was hoarse, drawing concerned stares from passers-by. I didn't care. This was catharsis, the purging of pent-up sorrow and self-loathing that had metastasized in my soul for far too long. As my tears subsided, an epiphany crystallized through the haze of grief. It wasn't about the damn ball. It never was. Those vicious thugs didn't need an excuse to be violent. The alcohol just stripped away the last vestiges of their flimsy humanity. They would have found a reason to brutalize Charlie or someone else regardless. My juvenile enthusiasm was just the spark that lit the powder keg of their barely contained rage and amorality. But it wasn't the cause. The blame for their heinous actions rested squarely on them and them alone. Intellectually, I had always known this, but now, I finally felt it with every fiber of my being. The suffocating burden of misplaced guilt and shame I had carried for decades began to dissolve. I thought of Kevin, how he tried in his fumbling teenage way to shield me and Tommy from the worst of it, to carry that trauma alone so we wouldn't have to. But we were just scared kids, not equipped to process something so horrific. I made a mental note to try to track Kevin down, let him know that I understood now, and that I forgave him, that I forgave myself. Sniffling, I hauled myself to my feet, staring at the abandoned store one last time. As I turned to leave, I heard it, that telltale crack of a bat meeting ball. The onlookers started pointing and yelling, "Foul!" I glanced skyward just in time to see that cursed ball hurtling directly toward me like a heat-seeking missile. Before I could react, it smashed through the one remaining pane of glass high on the building's facade. The shards tinkled musically to the ground, glinting in the afternoon sun. I let out a shaky laugh at the absurd poetry of it all. You can't make this shit up, I thought wryly. In the street, I spotted the ball hounds, a new generation of bright-eyed kids with their mitts at the ready. The poignant symmetry struck me. How many of them were using this game as an escape, a joyful outlet just like I had? How close had any of them come to witnessing something that would tear their innocence asunder? I saw my younger self reflected in their faces, and I just wanted to wrap them all in a protective embrace. I stooped to pick up the ball, cradling its worn leather in my hand. I could swear I saw a smudge of long-dried blood across the seams, but it was probably just a trick of the light, or my hyperactive imagination filling in morbid details. Either way, I knew what I had to do with it. The ghosts of my past had held me captive long enough. I locked eyes with the nearest kid, a scrappy towhead boy in an oversized Cubs cap. I remembered that feeling of yearning for a foul ball, how it held the promise of attaining something truly special. I tossed the ball to him with a knowing smile. "Here, kid, this one's for you. Make sure you get it signed." His face split into a megawatt grin, gap-toothed and guileless. "Gee, thanks, mister." The other kids crowded around to admire his treasure, their eager voices rising in excitement. I felt a lightness bloom in my chest, like some vital part of me had been restored. As I walked away, I realized that I had found the closure I so desperately sought, not by wallowing in the what-ifs and should-haves, but by confronting the past head-on, by allowing myself to fully feel the pain and finally forgiving myself, by reclaiming agency over my story and choosing to imbue it with new meaning. In that moment, I felt a bone-deep certainty that Charlie would have wanted this for me. Not a life half-lived, forever shackled to that terrible day, but one of resilience, of turning tragedy into healing, of finding light in the darkness. His memory would live on, not as a lifelong albatross around my neck, but as a reminder to cherish the fragility and preciousness of every moment, to stand up to injustice and cruelty wherever I saw it, to lead with compassion and spread more light. I emerged from my old neighborhood feeling lighter than I had in years. The late afternoon sun kissed my face as I threaded through the exuberant post-game crowds spilling from the stadium. Their joy was palpable, a contact high of collective revelry and camaraderie. For the first time in decades, I let it wash over me, reveling in the cacophonous celebration of the sport that had always meant so much to me. As the train traversed the city, I felt the puzzle pieces of my life shifting into a new configuration. The ragged wounds of the past would always be a part of me, but they no longer defined me. I had a second chance, an opportunity to build something beautiful from the rubble, to honor Charlie's legacy by embodying the ideals of integrity and decency he represented, to support organizations that combated alcoholism, mentored at-risk youth, and advocated for abuse victims, to be the change I wished to see. That foul ball had been the catalyst for so much pain, but in releasing it, I found the freedom to write a new ending to my story, one of hope, redemption, and renewal. As the sun dipped below the glittering skyline, I felt at peace for the first time in 44 years. The haunted 13-year-old boy could finally rest. At long last, I was home,